Monitoring and adjusting mash pH is something most brewers are familiar with, but is a step that many let fall by the wayside. How much does pH in beer really matter? Well, to find out, John Palmer has generously agreed to take us through his presentation on pH in beer, and trust me, there are a few gems in here. I for one learned that I've been using my pH meter wrong the whole time. Then in true Brülosophy style, we're going to take the theory and put it to the test in 2 experiments. What is pH? Why does it matter in beer? And can blind tasters detect a difference? Let's get into it. This episode is sponsored by ABS Homebrew. More on them in a bit.
Hi, I'm John Palmer, the author of How to Brew and the Water Book.
Now, before we get into the impact of pH in brewing, it's probably a good idea to briefly define what pH even is.
pH is a really interesting topic because when you realize that we've been brewing beer for thousands of years, the pH as a concept and as a measurement was not invented until like 1924. So it's new. pH is new. It is, by definition, the concentration and activity of hydrogen ions in solution measured as the negative log of the hydroxides, hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions being 2 sides of the same coin. But that very scientific definition is not very helpful for us brewers. As brewers, it's better to think of pH as a measure of chemical equilibrium in a solution. And when it comes to our wort, when it comes to our water, our brewing water, it is essentially a measurement of the balance of hardness to alkalinity in the water. So you can have a high mineral water and a low mineral water at the same water pH, same balance, but those 2 waters will have vastly different effects on the mash because, the mash chemistry is another, whole other box of frogs. And it's the chemical equilibrium of the mash that dictates how well our beer is going to turn out.
Now, something many homebrewers are aware of is the impact of temperature on pH.
Chemical equilibrium changes with temperature. So, as you increase the temperature of the solution, the molecules vibrate faster, they dissociate more. The actual equilibrium of that solution changes as a function of temperature. And so the pH is different at every different temperature you measure it at. As brewers, going back to 1924, and when pH was, one reason pH was invented was to help us quantify changes in the mash. But it took a long time to titrate and measure. And so it was done at room temperature in the lab. And that's where our gold standard for brewing pH at room temperature comes from. And so when we talk about mash pH, wort pH, beer pH, it's always done at room temperature. And this is per, both the European Brewing Congress guides and the ASBC methods.
Okay, so pH changes with temperature, but that was never much of a concern for me because I own a pH meter that has automatic temperature compensation, or ATC. So no matter what temperature I measure at, my pH meter will compensate to the true pH. Right?
Well, unfortunately, no. ATC is a very handy-dandy function that keeps the pH meter calibrated for you. So when you come into the lab in the morning or into your brewery and you calibrate your pH meter, you stick it in the pH 4 solution at room temperature, you stick it in the pH 7 buffer solution at room temperature, that pH meter is now calibrated at room temperature for room temperature solutions. If you measure a sample that's at a different temperature, the electrode in the pH meter that's calibrated at room is going to have a different response due to that change in temperature. And so what ATC does is it recognizes that difference in temperature from calibration to your new sample and says, okay, if I'm calibrated at 70, but this wort sample is at 95, the actual pH of this sample at 95 degrees is this, which is going to be a little bit lower due to the negative log of the scale. It's going to be a little bit lower at a higher temperature than it is at room temperature. And that's why when we talk about the pH range at room 5.2 to 5.6, we're trying to measure, at mash temperature, it's about 0.3 lower because of that change in temperature. So 5.2 to 5.6 measured at mash temperature would be 4.9 to 5.3 roughly, that same range. But again, we're supposed to be cooling the sample down to room, measuring it there, and that's where we're looking for 5.2 to 5.6.
And yeah, I've heard many times that a pH range of 5.2 to 5.6 is what we as brewers should be aiming for during the mash.
Okay, this was something that bugged me for years. I chased this down looking at various books and various documents and pestering various brewing luminaries. And it took me a while to realize that barley is an agricultural material. And we grow different varieties of barley in different countries of the world, different continents, different regions, spring varieties versus winter varieties. And the optimum pH for, say, conversion, that is the optimum pH for the activity of the saccharification enzymes, the amylases. Each amylase enzyme, we know we have alpha, beta, and limit dextranase, and actually there's a few more, and there are different isomers of each of those enzymes. All of them have their own pH, specific pH optima. If you isolate them and measure them, they're all going to be a little bit different. And so when we talk about an optimum pH, we're actually talking about a compromise or what works best for them as a whole. And then we have to take another step back and say, well, that's this group of enzymes. But if we talk about the glucanases, the pentasines, there's many other enzyme groups that also contribute to the breakdown of the starches, the solubilization of the starches, and the availability of those starches to the amylases. It's a whole group of things occurring at the same time that gets us to this optimum conversion. And so, in other words, given the fact that barley is an agricultural product, that its optima per variety, per region, and per maltster is going to vary a little bit. There is no single correct answer. That's what I'm coming up to. We talk about a range of conversion that seems to work well.
Now, the pH of beer is not static. It changes as we move through the mash and the boil and the fermentation.
We start out, with our water and our grain. We dough in, we measure our mash pH, and it's somewhere in this 5.2 to 5.6 range. That mash proceeds over the hour. pH continues to fall as those hydrogen ions get produced. And so by the time we enter the boil, the pH of the wort is around 5. And you will often read about various brewers acidifying their wort going into the boil or coming out of knockout, to get it to that kind of level going into the boil. During the boil, you have, evaporation occurring, you have hot break forming, cold break forming, a lot of chemistry going on in the boil. So as a result, the pH drops by up to another 0.3 during the course of the boil. depending on, many factors. So we come out of the boil a little bit lower and going into fermentation. Now in fermentation, the yeast take in amino acids from the wort, and they take in other nutrients such as your lipids, and they excrete protons. They maintain this electrochemical balance inside and outside the cell. That is what allows them to draw in these nutrients that they need, is the electrochemical difference between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. That's how they can pass these nutrients through the cell wall. So they excrete protons as they feed. And so pH ends up dropping by about another half during fermentation. And this is how we get from our mash pH of 5.2 to 5.6 down to our beer pH of about 4.0 to 4.6.
Now, in much the same way that we adjust water salt additions to emphasize the hoppiness or the maltiness of beer, we can use mash pH as a lever too, depending upon beer style.
A little lower beer pH tends to focus flavors. And so in the case of a Munich Helles, for example, a lower beer pH kind of brightens that singular pale malt character. It makes that, that bready character a little bit brighter and allows you to differentiate the malt and hop character in a pale lager like that. Also does the same in a pale ale, in a bright pale ale. A little lower beer pH tends to focus these flavors. When you go to a dark beer style, such as a porter or stout or Munich Dunkel, a little higher pH, and again, this would be like, say, 4.3 to 4.6, would help open up the malt flavors. And so when you're using several specialty malts in a dark beer, having that little higher beer pH helps open up those flavors and allows you to taste the different specialty malts that you've used. You get the little hint of caramel, little hint of, roast. It makes that beer more complex. Whereas if you have a low beer pH in a dark beer, those flavors are a little bit more focused, and you would only perhaps perceive kind of a singular roast character. Not going to taste bad. It is just going to be kind of focused. It's not going to be as complex as it potentially could be.
All right, to be completely candid here, I don't find myself considering mash pH on most of my brew days. If Brewfather tells me my combination of brewing water and malt is within range, I'll not bother measuring it or making adjustments. But maybe I should be. I mean, how much difference in the finished beer does this really make?
This level of water adjustment and this level of detail in terms of beer pH and so on, you're talking about maybe a 10% difference in the final beers, in the perception of flavor of that final beer. It is very often noticeable and significant, but it's a very small difference between the beers. So when I talk about your 5 brewing priorities, for a great beer, sanitation, yeast management, yeast temperature control, recipe, and ingredients, water adjustment is like number 6 on the list. pH is definitely significant, but it's that final tweak to make a good beer great or a good beer mediocre.
And of course, with this being Brülosophy, the effect of pH adjustments in beer is something we've run multiple tests on. I presented 2 such experiments to John, but before we get to those, a quick word on today's sponsor, ABS Homebrew. ABS Homebrew is the new name consolidating ABS Commercial, ABS Small Parts Shop, and Atlantic Brew Supply Homebrew Store all under one umbrella. ABS Homebrew offer a huge supply of beer ingredients and equipment for online order and fast shipping, and if you're ever in the Raleigh, North Carolina area, you owe it to yourself to stop by the store and check out their selection or participate in one of the many in-store events. Also, be sure to subscribe to their excellent Fermentality podcast hosted by Kat Pierce. You can find out more at atlanticbrewsupply.com. Right, to the experiments, and first up, Brew Club member Matt Skillstad tested the impact of high mash pH in a cream ale. Matt added his brewing water to 2 kettles and in 1 kettle treated his water with 85% phosphoric acid. Now Matt added his grains and then saw that the treated water had a mash pH of 5.28, which is considered within the optimal pH range, while his untreated water batch had a mash pH of 6.12.
6.1 at mash temperature would translate to, say, 5.8 at room. Maybe 5.9. Hard to say. But as we talked about earlier, conversion is actually more effective at higher pH. So the conversion of the mash and the production of the sugars is going to pop along just fine at a higher pH. The risk is tannin extraction and silicate extraction from the grain husks. Cream ale has less grain husk in it, than, say, a comparable OG pale ale, or porter for that matter. So this is, one, you might not expect as much astringency out of this particular recipe and style as you would at the same pH for a porter. You might expect a little bit more potential for astringency from a porter.
By the end of brew day, Matt took a gravity reading to see that both batches were at a near identical original gravity reading of 1050 and 1051, and then he racked the 2 beers to 2 fermenters, pitched a packet of US 05 yeast, and a few weeks later when fermentation was complete, he took another set of gravity readings, and there was a noticeable difference. 1.016 in the high mash pH beer and 1.012 in the standard mash pH beer.
The lower finishing gravity is telling us that the beta was more active, and had better conversion or better longevity in the lower pH mash than the higher pH mash.
Matt also took pH readings, and as expected, the beer with the higher starting pH at mash time retained a higher pH in the finished beer. The high mash pH beer was also noticeably clearer, but could tasters tell a difference? Well, the beer was presented to 20 participants. Each participant was served 2 samples of the high mash pH beer and 1 sample of the standard mash pH beer in different coloured opaque cups, then asked to identify the unique sample. Now, a total of 11 tasters would have had to accurately identify the unique sample to reach statistical significance, which is exactly how many did. Now, when we get a significant result, we ask the participants who identified the odd beer out which beer was their preference, and 3 tasters reported preferring the high mash pH beer, 6 liked the standard mash pH beer better, and 2 had no preference despite noticing a difference. And in his own tests, Matt could pick the odd beer out every single time, and he said that to him the high mash pH beer retained a slight harshness and generally tasted just a bit lifeless, whereas the standard mash pH beer was much cleaner and brighter with a more citrusy hop flavour.
And that kind of follows where, as I say, lower pH tends to focus and brighten flavors. Higher pHs tend to broaden them. In a pale ale, a high beer pH just comes across as a more bitter beer. Yeah. But in a lager, like a cream ale, where you have a low hop character and you're looking for kind of a brighter malt character to give that beer some life, the lower pH beer would be perceived as a livelier, brighter beer.
Now, the second experiment tested boil pH. Former Brülosophy contributor Malcolm Fraser brewed 2 American IPAs, making no adjustments to pH during the mash. And at the conclusion of the mash rest, both batches were at 5.45 pH. Matt then added 2.5 milliliters of 77% phosphoric acid to one of the batches, bringing its pH all the way down to 5.12. Malcolm then proceeded to boil, chill and ferment the two beers in separate vessels. While both beers had the same OG, the high boil pH beer finished at 1.013, while the treated low boil pH beer attenuated down to 1.018. There was also a noticeable difference in pH in the finished beer, but it was a smaller delta now, so 4.50 to 4.39.
So were the triangle test able to differentiate these beers?
Well, a total of 42 people participated in this experiment, each blindly served 2 samples of the higher boil pH beer and 1 sample of the lower boil pH beer. While 20 tasters would have had to accurately identify the low boil pH sample as being different in order to reach statistical significance, only 15 did, suggesting they were unable to reliably distinguish the beers. That said, Malcolm reported preferring the higher boil pH beer as he perceived the bitterness as being a bit more assertive without being overly harsh.
Yeah, in a hoppy IPA, a little higher boil pH would influence the hop isomerization. You get better isomerization at higher boil pHs than you do at low boil pHs because the hops isomerize better at a higher pH. And so in terms of an IPA character, that may lend itself to a bit more bitterness, and that would be a factor for perception of flavor difference between the two beers.
So one experiment came back significant when there was a large mash pH difference, and the other came back non-significant when there was a smaller boil pH difference. But for me, seeing the results of these experiments and in talking to John, mash pH is something I'm going to spend a little bit more time focusing on in the future. And I'm going to remember that I need to take pH measurements at room temperature, even when my pH meter has automatic temperature calibration. Look, a massive thank you to John for taking us through this and for sharing his presentation. And John also sat down with me and talked about what happens if you mash your beers for a duration other than 60 minutes, and you can see that video right here.